Welcome, everyone. We're glad you could all make it. This is By Example, runs until September 9th, and we are happy to present to you 5 of the artists today. 1 question directed per artist, general questions, and if we still have some time, we would love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments. So, okay, first question is to Eric. In your response, you mentioned paying homage to laborers. Why do you consider that an important focus in your work?
So a lot of the works and materials that I use in my works are kind of industrial materials. They're materials that, like, for example, the piece right here is entirely made out of recycled fishing nets. And so when I think about that and my material and how I'm using it, I want to think about the people that used it before me, and that kind of paying tribute to them in a lot of senses. So in some of the newer works I've been making, I've been working a lot with like doilies and kind of going around thrift stores and picking up all of these kind of basically like lost craft artists in a lot of sense. And I think also, and I think it's just holding respect to kind of where these materials and how these labors and jobs that we don't really appreciate so much. And then trying to approach my work and how I approach my material with that same kind of dedication to labor and the same amount of like energy that's put into it, even if it is like something from like strapping from a seamstress shop that I got and recycled back into one of my pieces. It's like they're kind of artists in themselves that just don't get any recognition, and I try to have my work be a collaboration between them and me, even if I don't personally know them.
Right. Yeah, there seems to be a very sophisticated balance between craft and fine art, and especially when you use language of craftspeople, and it's your sensibility and using those motifs and those materials to pay homage to them that, from what I could tell, really resonates, in your practice.
Thank you. And I mean, yeah, with like that piece in particular, so like on these fishing net boats, they repair these nets over and over and over and over again. So when I approach that piece, every single spot that is connected in making it is actually kind of stitched together, but just with super glue. So it kind of actually has another element of kind of exactly how they mend and create them. And basically these all were recycled, so they hit a point when they couldn't be used anymore. And I feel like that's kind of where artists can step in again.
Yeah, what's also powerful is to take commercial fishing net, which may have some controversial aspects to it, and then to subvert it in your own ways by freezing it essentially, rendering it useless, and then having your own using your own hand to force it to become an art object for appreciation instead of controversy.
Is it already rendered useless when you said they're repurposed? Are they beyond function?
Yeah, so after a certain amount of tears happen in a net, it just becomes, basically waste for them.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too. Yeah. I don't know why.
But they do, like, on site, will stitch them back together, like...
To reuse
them. To reuse them,
so
yeah. So if, like, your net tears when you're fishing,
so you're
like, you can go in and you'll stitch it back together.
I mean, you're continuing the same exact process, but for a new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since we're asking follow-up questions, do you consider it any type of an environmental statement? Because fishing nets have become synonymous with us thinking about discarded fishing nets and hurting the ocean and all of that. So I just wondered if there's any like ecological statement on what you're thinking about when you make that work.
I mean, I think it's in the work, it's in the material, but I use so many different materials so that I wouldn't say necessarily I'm making a comment on environment, so to say. I think it's like a nice element to my work that I am recycling industrial materials. I mean, in some of my, earlier works, I wasn't recycling everything. In some of the series that I have, it's like don't recycle. I buy them brand new.
Right.
So in these newer bodies, I'd say these are, I think it's not the main point of it. I think it's more about the labor that goes into it and that communication between me and the past information and history that's within the material.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm very much more of a process artist, I think, than environmental.
Yeah.
Is there something that you do to the net to help control, like how you want to shape it, to make it more rigid or less rigid? Or is there something that you treat it with? Or is it bendable in a way that you allows you to conform it?
So it all starts actually just kind of like in the bottom part of it. That's all just kind of actually loose netting. So that's how it originally comes. And then I'll basically create a shape, so I have these kind of cages that I build and then hang them, and then I'll freeze it in a plastic. And then I'll turn it, add another section of the netting, I'll sit there, cut it out, and then kind of sit there with super glue and glue each little tiny dot to itself, freeze it in plastic, and then I'll spin it again. And that's kind of how you get the different motions and actions that don't make it all just one big droop.
Gotcha.
All right, thanks a lot, Eric. The next question is directed to T. You mentioned the importance of embracing mistakes in your practice. What do you find rewarding about allowing those mistakes to show?
Well, I think in part I have an issue with the word reward in it, but I think that aside, allowing the mistakes to show is kind of my ability to come to terms with mistakes in general. And if I spent too much time harping on them, I feel like the projects would never finish. And I want the things to be done. And the mistakes, I think, are it may sound cheesy, but I think it's kind of the world giving its hand in the project. And I'm not going to be the one to stop kind of the nature of how things happen. And I don't think they're necessarily a mistake anymore, although it may appear as a mistake, and I'm not going to be the one to say it's not a mistake, because it may be one, but I think if I spend too much time considering them mistakes, nothing will get done.
Would you say it's in that way and just an inevitable part of the process?
In my process, yes. I think some people try to perfect their process and try to get it to a point where it's this polished thing.
Right.
But I think that's a little too much design.
What would that compromise for you?
If I spent too much time, I just don't think I'd be able to. I think I'd get too bored with the projects. I think if I, the orange splotch right there on the, I don't know, right there, you see it. That orange splotch, if that happened, I would have had, it did happen and it was a mistake, but if I harped on it, I don't think this would get finished because it was so far into the process. And instead of just saying I'm done, this happened, I can't pursue it to how I wanted it to be, I kind of paused and I thought that what does this add to it instead of take away? Because I think that a mistake can take away, but it can also add. And I think if anything, it's additive. I don't think it subtracts from anything.
Right. So would you say it plays with your level of acceptance within the work?
Yeah. Well, of anything.
Right.
Yeah. And that's something I try to work. I don't know. I think for a long time I was worried about, art being perfect, and then I realized that it's not, and that it's, yeah, I don't know, it's not. But I think reward in there was something I was thinking about a lot as well. I don't remember how I was thinking about it, but I think that the use of reward ties it to this outcome that's desired, and it's the opposite of what this is. Because although the outcome is what I wanted generally, it's not exactly what I wanted, but that's fine. And I think reward is the outcome that you do want. Or maybe not the outcome that you do want, but it's a happenstance of that outcome.
Right. So although mistakes are inevitable, not all of them are rewarding. Not all of them are beneficial in some sense.
Maybe not, but I think they can be. I think it's how you look at it. I mean, maybe not. Maybe not. But I think more often than not, people see a mistake as a negative thing. Well, it doesn't have to be.
Right. I feel like as an artist, we all play within our own definitions of what is intentional, what is not, and where is that gray area, where is that margin between finding discovery and working towards a place of harmony. So.
And I think harmony is a good word. I think it's that kind of dance between, for me, I think harmony is that dance between the mistake and the intention.
Right.
And the mistake isn't me. I mean, it is me, but I think it's something bigger than that. And then the intention is me. And when both combine, it's kind of like, that's the art.
Right. Like with Eric's work, you mentioned the tears, the natural tears in the net. And perhaps without those tears, perhaps without those mistakes, it would take on an entirely different form, or it would guide your decision-making towards a different outcome.
Yeah, that's a good example of that. I mean, that's Eric using the tears. That's like something that happened to the net, and you're using it. You're using that mistake in your piece. And I think it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Except he didn't have the ability to control the tear in the way that I can, like, you know what I mean? Like, that happened before the piece. Unless I guess you could tear it. Did tears ever happen while you were making it? Would it then tear or no?
No, I mean, there'll be like just giant sections of it.
Yeah.
Missing, but yeah. No.
How was the surface applied?
How was the surface?
Surface applied to that.
So, I mean, the whole process was Zach helped me build the frame, and then we stretched a canvas over it, which was a prior work. I had a canvas that was screen printed on, but the whole thing is screen print, yeah. But we screen printed on something, and then I stretched it, and then we painted it, and that's why you can kind of see paintbrush marks, because we painted it with just like gesso, and like really streaky, and then painted the whole thing yellow, and then screen printed on it, yeah.
So perhaps mistakes are just opportunities.
I think they are. Yeah.
Depends how you look at them. Cool. All right. Bill, you're up.
Pass. Just kidding. Go ahead. I'm just teasing.
When I have heard you speak about your work in the past, you often reference the mystical or spiritual. For example, your use of themes relating to Buddhist culture and sacred geometries. Can you share some thoughts about the importance of spirituality in your own work and how you might find that a unifying principle?
Well, that's a complicated question, but I'll...
Spiritual, I didn't miss one point of the question.
He was basically talking about this influence of spirituality in my work, and then also influences of like sacred geometry. So I would say, like, I think like words like Buddhism, spirituality, I think you could say like have a lot of cliches to them. Like you could even think that means something that could be good or moral, ethical. So I would say within my practice, I would be more inclined to speak in terms of embodiment, ritual, emotional intelligence, physical intelligence that comes from repetition in the body when you're making. And I think those actually is very evident in the show, Zach, and I think you've done a really good job of showing ritual in different forms, and how someone said to me that a good work of art tells a good story, but actually a really good work of art, the story is hard to see at the end. And so I think a lot of the works in the show actually have very interesting qualities to them that have to do with both material and the time of the material, but then also to this question of energy or magic. And so in particular with my practice, I would say I really relate it more to that question. That's a really hard question to answer. So I would say I think about that in terms of discipline, which would translate to doing the same things in my everyday life that I apply to the studio. And then also, I've always had this curiosity about essence and how does that exist in a work of art? So one could say, maybe instead of using words like spirituality, I think I've been really attracted to how an artist's physical body is left in the work. And someone said to me once that shoes are actually a really simple example of that, where the impression of our spirit is actually left in our impressions on our shoes. And so I think that does exist in the time, actually, in a lot of these pieces in the show that you can see. And I know you're the curator, and I'm avoiding talking about myself by doing this, but I also think about, I've been just thinking a lot about, I'm avoiding answering that question, but yeah, I do think that it's probably just more about how I've always tried to maybe think about ritual, the body, and how that relates to when I make work.
Right. What would you say then, discipline or routine? What does that allow for you?
One thing that people say a lot about my work is they're like, your work is so relaxed, it's so playful, it's so colorful, but I actually think that that doesn't really happen. It only happens really through consistency. So I would say I have a very obsessive compulsive, I do the same thing over and over again. And so I think, like someone said to me once, art does keep me out of trouble in that way. So I do think that in terms of discipline, it's more about like what rules I follow every day or we follow in the studio as artists. Because I think a lot of us in the show actually have similarities, I think, to ritual process that I think is evident in all the pieces in the show. I think you did a good job showing that.
Well, if it wasn't for the help of such wonderful artists,
I'm a nervous talker too, so that was good. I'm done. No, I'm just kidding.
No, that was great.
But I know you have questions, so we can go to the next one.
Sure. So Lynn, over the last year or two, I've gotten the privilege to understand a bit about your different practices. You are tenacious when it comes to pivoting mediums such as ceramics, encaustic, and fiber, not to mention a slew of public art commissions, to name a few. So I'm curious, how would you explain the relationship between freedom and control within your own practice? And does it manifest differently when you are making for an expected outcome versus for yourself?
That is a painfully astute question, Zach. I love how you're able to just cut to the quick of what all our conversations have been. There are a couple of things I have in response to that. First of all, I have a lot of constraints when I'm working on public art, and I find those very inhibiting, and so I'm in a constant state of stress because I'm having to please other people and a whole community. It's like no pressure, but a whole community that's going to be seeing my work, and it has to represent them somehow, but it has to still be a work of art, and it has to be original, and it can't look like it's pandering, and that just causes me a tremendous amount of stress. And then in my studio, I have total freedom, which also causes me a tremendous amount of stress. And because I know there's work in me that's trying to get out, but yet there are so many constraints I put on myself. It's actually brilliant that you have these two pieces in the show, the tapestry from 1984 and my painting from like 3 weeks ago, because I was so tight when I was an artist. When I started out as an artist, I started studying ceramics when I was 12 years old, and then moved into fiber when I was 15, and then studied ceramics through undergraduate school. But I often wonder, where did that, I look now at that extreme amount of control that I was exerting on my fiber art. Like you do a cartoon and you sketch it out and then you draw it, and it has all these references and symbolism in it. And then I gradually started burying them and shooting them and trying to do things that were out of my control, that were mistakes or accidents, to the point now where I've been on this very aggravating quest to get my ego off of my work, to get control out of my work and let the medium just do what the medium does. And it's constantly destined to fail because my hand-body connection is showing up on the canvas, or the panel in this case. So yeah, it's a constant dance and not a fun one between freedom and control.
What would make it more fun?
Getting out of my friggin' head.
But thank you for that response, Lynn, because I feel like it pulls on similar threads to questions about mistakes and questions about discipline and routine and ritual. So I wonder if you embody different. I'm sure you're limited differently to each medium you work in, but I wonder how you would organize your more of a general sense of decision making when it comes to your different practices that plays on routine or more discipline, and how that could kind of affect the outcome.
You mean discipline in the sense of how Bill was talking about it? As far as almost a monastic discipline or a routine, embracing the routine? Is it like that sort of thing?
Sure, yeah. Like, what, if any, differences, would you have, I don't know, making an encaustic versus a large public artwork? I'm sure planning phases are different, but, I wonder if there are other aspects in your life that you would, you're trying to work to make sure that you have a pretty good outcome for each endeavor.
So we're talking about how maybe material choice determines how you approach something, or when it ends up, how it finishes.
Yeah.
I mean, this also brings up this question of subjectivity. Like, how do you determine whether it's actually, I don't want to use good or bad, let's say a meaningful work of art.
Right.
Because that's about time and material. So are you asking maybe about how the difference in time and material affects outcome?
Yeah, we could go off of that. That's fine.
Well, no, it's just to clarify.
Oh, yeah, no, with public art, of course, you have a limited budget. You have the community's expectations. Yes, Bill? William? And I am able to use any materials I want to use, but I tend to keep going back to the same ones with public art because I have some trusted fabricators. I work with, steel, mosaic, glass, stone, concrete, and that's really fun to do. As far as encaustic is a really expensive medium to work in, so I've had to it's all relative. It's not like gold leaf or anything, which I did do a gold leaf one, and I used like $2,000 of gold leaf on a smaller piece than this. A lot, and about half of that was just through trial and error. Anyway, so I just, to answer the question briefly, I train myself not to worry about how much material costs, because if I put or how much I'm wasting. Because if I put that on myself too, then that's just going to be another constraint, another bit of stress that I put on myself.
Right. So it's interesting. Would you say that you have to compensate differently for public art in order to show more of your hand and have more freedom?
Oh God, that's such a And this is this thing I'm struggling with right now. Is I want to make the authenticity of the aesthetic in my public art come closer to what it is in my studio work. And I'm failing miserably.
Okay, last one's to Glenn. It seems you are constantly guided by your curiosity when it comes to choosing subject matter. The trees seem to allude to a sense of optimism and transformation, especially in relationship to environments that seem to challenge their existence. Could you share how else you see the natural world as an influence in your practice?
I started thinking about the natural world as a design influence by looking at architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, who take into consideration the natural world, not just in their actual design, but the way that a building may be situated on a land. And so I started kind of thinking about that a lot in my own work. Like, so I would photograph an urban setting or an architectural setting, and I'll try to photograph some nature nearby, knowing that I would try to create a work, whether it's a wall covering, an individual work of art, or a window installation that brings the imagery together for a dialogue. With the tree works here and the outlines that we did here, I felt like that's a little bit of more of an expanded conversation and a little bit more into the human condition. The first image that I shot of the tree, the original tree, was in a setting I shot in Osaka. And when I was looking at the photo, I was also thinking about a brother. I lost one of my brothers about 30 years ago. And I often think about, well, what kind of a person would he be today? Well, you know, I mean, he had a big heart. He was this, like, really funny person. He was an amazing dancer, but he never got to live out to sort of his full potential. And so when I started thinking about outlining these trees, sort of foreseeing or having a sort of a hopeful vision of what I thought, you know, the kind of person he would be. And it started making me think about other people that I've lost and myself and just people that you know that are maybe even on hard times, but you try to see past that and try to see them in sort of full bloom. And so I started just moving that tree into different urban settings. I started realizing it's this sort of ongoing or expanding conversation about architecture, nature, the human condition, and it's an ongoing conversation. I feel like it's continuing to expand.
Right. It travels with you.
Indeed. Yes.
Especially because you chose each location based off of personal accounts, personal meanings. Of course, it's a very poignant relationship between your brother and this symbolism of the foliage and perhaps the tree itself. And that's what made me resonate with them in the first place, was that it has such a direct comparison to us, and questions about who we could be. And yeah, I think it's really powerful series.
Well, doing the installation in this space with the outlines on the 5 windows, and people that I know that have come to visit the gallery have sort of missed that. Wait, there was a window installation? Yeah. And I understand it's so linear and it's almost invisible. In certain ways you may stand outside, the light would hit it and it would, you know, stand out more. But I think this is the first time I've been able to use just the outlines. And what I find interesting is when you're standing outside as people walk by or people freeze, they're being encompassed by that, and looking from the inside looking out, it's the same thing. People will stop, and they're being surrounded by that. And across the street, we have these trees, which is something you and I talked about at the opening, and I appreciate that comment. And that's another thing. I like to hear what people think about it, because I think that, you know, if you sort of decide, well, this is what my art's about, you're maybe limiting what other people want to consider your work to be. And maybe you'll discover things about yourself in those conversations.
I thought they were outlines of the trees across the street, and that's what I told other people when I was explaining your work to them.
Well, I love that. And, that really made me think too. So appreciate that.
Yeah. But you are, you know, I see your work as like you're toying with our perceptions of what's around us, you know, and the idea to have the outlines in the windows, you know, plays on the idea of windows in the first place, and looking into an environment that has further meaning, and then, you know, when they make their way into the gallery and they see your work up close, you know, it provides even more context for that. But they also are, you know, they're personal opportunities to essentially like look into, which. Well, your passion for the work really helped drive this installation, and I appreciate that, because I think that our conversation and your enthusiasm sort of opened up another window, if you will, and so I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Glenn.
Sure.
It was a pleasure. Having the chance to speak with each of you individually, there seems to be a connection between sincerity and personal investigation, but there also seems to be a joyful freedom in many of your works. Would you consider play and investigation mutually exclusive, or how would they overlap? Unless that's too specific. But essentially...
Thinking about this question of subjectivity, because that sort of alludes to this idea of like what is playful and what is... No, I'm just really thinking about that question because in terms of how anyone thinks what a playful work of art looks like versus somebody else is very subjective. Like you could also think that could bring up cliched notions of like scribbling or non-skill as a means, but that's, I don't know, I'm just saying, but that question, I don't even know how to answer that question you asked, but I would say.
I think I was trying to frame it as, instead of working from pre-planned notions or a blueprint or anything structural that's outside of one's own sort of immediate focus.
Well, I think that also could actually have to do with like when you go and get a massage, they sort of say, okay, just relax, and your body never does that. It's the opposite that happens.
Right.
So that's like when you would say to someone, make a playful work of art, just relax. It's like that doesn't occur ever. But it would occur, I would say, after you're doing something for long enough that you stop caring. And then, see people, they can talk about this. But then eventually improvisation happens, right? Because you're like, stop thinking so much about it. You guys are not.
So it's a level of confidence, maybe.
I also feel that I can be more playful now that I have mastery over the medium, too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm somebody that never sketches anything, never has a plan to begin with, really. I've found in my practice that anytime I have a good idea, it's usually not. And if I already have made the piece of art in my head, it's already kind of been made. So I'm a person that lives very much on happy accidents and embracing them, and I'm also very process repetition, very like, my works take a lot of time. Right. So going back on exactly what I just said in a certain way, it's kind of like I don't want to say it, but I do, almost like the problem with the good ideas, then you have to do it. And then you're kind of, I don't know, like I play a lot. Like I'm very much playful in my studio. I do all these tests, experiments, and it's constantly evolving, and my works constantly evolve through the meticulous practice. But sometimes it's just the playfulness stops, in a sense. I don't know if I'm getting off track here, but it's just a weird balance of that, where it's there's a certain playfulness that exists in the beginning, and then the end of it, sometimes it feels like work. I'm gonna sound like a bad artist.
But Eric,
I'm passing.
But Eric, you and I talked about that we talked about that before, right? Between trying to create this sense of like spontaneity maybe in our work, and embracing our own mediums with a way that could build upon itself, and perhaps ideas work in that same way, where I know you don't like to beholden yourself to one concept or one idea, and that allows for a lot of different work manifesting in different ways, in different materials.
It's kind of the ecology of the studio. Something falls on something, something is cut off something, you have masked something. It's like, I don't know, kind of comes naturally. It's like an ecosystem almost.
Right.
I think to that point, I think for me the playfulness ends when I start making the work. I think I do make the work in my head, and then I have to make it physically. But I think the work is pretty. I have all the ideas of what I want to make, and if the accidents happen, the accidents happen. But I think I play a lot in my head with the ideas, and then when I start making it, I make it pretty quickly. It doesn't take that long, and I I don't really play through that process. Like, I don't think there's any, I'm pretty, I go into it with the decisions I know I'm gonna make, and if an accident happens, an accident happens. Maybe that's playful, but yeah.
So, yeah. So you want to just continue to find something new?
I guess, but I mean, we were having this conversation the other day in the car where we were talking about how we make work, and how with you kind of have this, the way in which you make work, you allow yourself to be inspired. I said your right hand plays off of what your left hand just did. Like you can kind of do, you can kind of do this push and pull with your mind and body. And with my work, like my mind makes a decision, and then my body does it, and the push and pull happens in my mind beforehand. Like I don't then make work. I don't make rash decisions in my work, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like all my decisions are pretty calculated, unless it's a mistake, and that's, I guess.
Right. Glenn, how about for you? Since you
I
and
really
T.
feel connected to both the way you guys describe your practice, and so I concur with a lot of what you're saying. And there's not too many accidents, and sometimes I work with a lot of industrial materials, and I'm thought, well, what would happen if I put this in front of this? And I may get an outcome that I want to pursue, but on the other hand, I may not, and I may sort of like cast that to the side. A lot of times I'll make samples of things. Oh, okay, I'll get this media, I get that just are polished, and I'll assemble something, a sort of a smaller version of it, and put it to the side and see if I still feel as strong about it when I created it. And if I feel like that it's something that's continuing to resonate with me, and I want to sort of chase a body of work from those materials that were started out as sort of experiments. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, all right, next one. There seems to be many signifiers for inspiration. There seems to be many signifiers for inspiration between traveling abroad, viewing ancient works, or drawing from materials with contemporary significance. How do you create conditions for which allow for inspiration to come in? Perhaps this is a little related to the last question. So,
A little bit. I mean, I definitely feel like when I'm traveling somewhere, a lot of ideas come seeping in. I keep a notebook right there. I'm photographing things and compiling ideas. And I think, and then it'll get me excited to go to the studio. But getting away from the studio and going on a trip somewhere, my son was raised in Bangkok, so I did a lot of overseas trips for about 15 years straight, and I would take stopovers in Japan and Seoul and in Hong Kong and all these different places traveling and photographing and just compiling imagery and compiling ideas.
Yeah.
And by the time I get back, I had pages and pages of notes and imagery I could work with, and I would excitedly say, okay, I'm ready to pursue a body of work. But yeah, I think that's, I mean, getting to I probably got off your question a little bit, but.
No, that's great.
Okay.
To jump off the traveling notion, I haven't really traveled too much in my life, but I do think it's important to get out of that headspace, and I had the luxury of going to Turkey, God, it must have been like close to 10 years ago, and how their markets, their shops, the bazaars, and how it's all kind of built and everything. It expanded my mind, especially in the textile world, and I think that like was super helpful. Like I went there and I threw out all my clothes and just brought home just scraps of fabric. It's like that's where all the scraps end, and you go to this bazaar and it's like they're just standing on piles of fabric, and it's like you sit there and you just like are picking it out, and like, you know, and then you turn a corner and it's 6 freaking blocks of buttons. It's like, you know what I mean? And you're just like, okay, like, you know, so getting out in those kind of experiences is very helpful. I feel like also having a good network of artists, going to the studios, talking, and getting out of my own head is one of the most important things for my practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm all about the Neanderthal mind and fossils. So I'm trying to, all my ceramics have to do with what if we discovered fossils that showed evidence of human making on them, and what would that feeling of discovery be? So that's, I go way back, troglodyte on that one. I also am really anxious to hear the audience's questions.
Yeah. Let's get to them.
So we can flip, I don't know for time, I mean, do you want to?
Oh, no, we're only 40 minutes in right now. Yeah. But
Can we take a break for audience questions after Bill says his piece?
I feel like I haven't been feeling very inspired for a while now, so I feel like I relate to this question of traveling or just movement. I think walking is good. I don't know if it's really traveling, but just like moving, I think is a good form of that for me.
By moving your body or moving?
Yeah, just moving into different
Domiciles or-
spaces or just outside of that, so you don't feel stuck.
yeah.